Hi, I wanted to do a compare and contrast on two biographical works in the world of manga. One is the Osamu Tezuka story that was done by Toshio Ban and Tezuka Productions. The other one is autobiographical by Yoshihiro Tatsumi, A Drifting Life. So I'm going to talk first about Osamu Tezuka. Now, I only got into manga a few years ago, and so everything has been kind of a lesson for me. I've read quite a few of the quote-unquote serious manga that Osamu Tezuka's done. I've read some Astro Boy as well. And I saw this at my local comic shop, and apparently this came out not too long after Mr. Tezuka passed away, and it was done in Japan. And what they did was they did a biography of Osamu Tezuka's life. The thing is that it was drawn by Toshio Ban, who was Tezuka's sub-chief. It's almost like his right-hand person, his second in command. And it was done by the Tezuka Productions. So it looks a lot like Tezuka's drawing it, which is kind of interesting. And they even use the character Mustachio, who I believe was in Astro Boy, and or he's been in other comics, a manga as well, sort of as a narrator, like the one overall narrator in the story, but he's not narrating every page. So it's that device they use like in Astro Boy sometimes or another manga. And this actually starts off from the beginning, 1920, 1945, and then different ages, phases of his life up until, he passed away. And if you ever want to know everything about Tezuka, how he started, what his influences are, what drove him, and all the things he contributed to manga, to anime, to pop culture, not only in Japan, but also to us, this is the book. Now, I'm going to warn you, this book is over 800 pages. It's never boring. It's great. But there's a lot to dig in here, but you will know everything you want about Tezuka. And it's also on the side a history of manga. And there's also a lot of events here in the life of a mangaka. Like you'll often see scenes where he's at his home and he's drawing, and there's like 4 or 5 manga editors, because Tezuka was known to do 4 or 5 or 6 manga at the same time. He was always running late and he was working all the time. The man was beyond driven. It's a lot of interesting facts about him. I can't cover it in a 10-minute podcast, but he actually became a doctor. He was actually a doctor, but he decided he wanted to do manga. But then he was always, then he started trying to do anime, and he's trying to figure out, okay, how can we do things in anime quicker so we can turn around week to week? That sort of thing. So they came out with a lot of those animation styles where they kind of like repeat the same type of animation over and over, and just change a few things just so that way it'd be quicker. And I just told the story, enough of the story. A lot of those little shortcuts that you do in manga, where maybe you don't draw the background, certain things you do in anime as well. And it's really fascinating because you get a history of manga, because in Japan they call Tezuka the god of manga, and you can see why. And they talk about his influence on anime. And then at the end of this book, you have appendixes, and the appendixes are, besides all the quotes and everything, there's a complete bibliography of everything Tezuka did in manga, anime, even if it's unfinished. Everything is here. This is everything you ever want to know about Tezuka, and also it's a great history of how manga was around before he started getting into it, but how he drove and shaped manga, and the influences of that even to this day you'll have in the art form. So, like I said, it's a thick book, but if you want to know more about him and really gain an appreciation for everything he did, this is the book you get. Can't recommend it enough. Next book I have is A Drifting Life by Yoshihiro Tatsumi. And Tatsumi is a famous mangaka, and he's known as the father of Gekiga. Gekiga was a movement in the late 50s with the book that he did called Black Blizzard. Is a movement of a more serious manga, crime, noir. And then later on, he started getting into drawing stories about the life of Japan in the 60s and 70s, because even though the economy was booming, there was a lot of sociological pressures and a lot of things going on, and he kind of like talked a lot about that underside. But he's the father of Gekiga, which is a offshoot of manga, and so it's pretty interesting because it also talks about his life, and it talks about him drawing and becoming a mangaka, and then changing his style and trying to become, create something different. And he does mention here that he does meet with Tezuka and get to know Tezuka. And apparently Tezuka wasn't a super big fan of Gekiga. I think he had his thoughts of what manga should be like. And if you've read of any of Tatsumi's works here, this character is a character he used often, and it was like an everyman character. So he draws himself like that character, which is kind of interesting. And so it talks about, him, and he's got a brother who's not well, but he's also a manga artist. And some of the conflicts when you have to me, it looks like an envious brother. And he mentions like trying to create Gekiga, and he's being told, oh, that's not really manga. You can't call this manga. And it's kind of interesting how you have like gatekeeping back even in the 50s. So this is interesting because Tezuka's book is a history of Tezuka, and he's the history of manga. And this is sort of like not a parallel, but it's like another history, but they run parallel to each other. So it's seeing two different sides of the same coin. So I find this interesting, and I like his work a lot. His work is a lot darker. Tezuka can go from Astro Boy and Fun and Light to more very serious manga. Tezuka's manga Letters to Adolf is excellent. That's very serious manga as far as just the themes and the tone. This is really very well done, and this is an autobiography. He's changed a few things, but overall, this is a great book to read as well. This is also a little over 100 pages, but this reads a lot faster than the Tezuka book. That's the one thing I've noticed about manga. Manga, you can actually read it pretty quickly, and usually. And so, and then the one interesting thing about this book, and here little things that's going on in history, like in this 1958, Elvis Presley is drafted into the war and things like that. So he does talk about what's going on in the world, just like Tezuka does. And it's quite interesting. So the ending of this book, and the reason why I wanted to mention is that the last chapter of this book, For a Drifting Life, ends where, the epilogue, where Tatsumi goes to the funeral for Osamu Tezuka, and he talks about how sad and how hard that was and how much he meant to all of them. And it's interesting how he draws himself like with this shade on his face, almost like a veil here, and you can just tell that he's really saddened by he's just feeling that loss, because even though maybe Tezuka didn't really dig Gekiga that much, wasn't his style, they all recognize him as the god of manga. And so it kind of ends with that, on that footnote, and kind of like reflecting on his life. So it's really well done. They also, both books, especially this one, talks a lot about the influence of after the war, of having American GIs. It talks about when they were having to deal with post-war Japan after the atomic bombs were dropped. It's pretty interesting because, in the States, a lot of people just had this idea of, oh, Japan's economy boomed after the war and this and that. But this actually gives you a feeling of like what it was to live in that Japan. Not all the time, but in a lot of his works that he did, you really get that feeling of, okay, we're in Japan, we're in our country, but then there's GIs all over the place. And it's kind of interesting. It's just something that you don't talk about here. So it's good to see that. So I love his work. I think I have everything except there's one book or a couple of stories that he's had translated in English that I don't have, that I have to hunt down. But I really like his manga very much. He has, I believe, 6 volumes that were published by Adrona Quarterly. And actually, Adrian Tomina was the one that found his work when he was young, and then he was able to get Drawn and Quarterly to get those works translated in English. So it's kind of interesting how you have an old mangaka who influences a young cartoonist who who comes back and makes the older mangaka relative again. And I think that I saw an interview one time where Tatsumi later in life came to the United States to San Diego Comic-Con, and they had a huge line for him, you know. And I think it was an interview with Adrian Tomina, and he was talking about how they just had a huge line. There was just a lot of reverence for him, and that his wife told him, you know, I didn't really think that he was a success until today, because apparently he gave up manga and he was just running a used bookstore. So it's kind of interesting how it influences somebody like Tomina, who's one of the best living cartoonists in America today, and how he kind of like pays reverence by making him relevant again. So anyway, these are two great books. This one does read right to left like a traditional manga. This reads, I guess, I think this is before Drawn and Quarterly realized that, hey, Americans are kind of hip enough to where we can read right to left, so they made this left to right. Both books are great. Very well done. Different in tone a little bit, but both excellent books to read. If you read this, you will have not a complete history of manga because there's other manga, but you will have a really good history of manga and the major events. Anyway, thanks.